There is a specific kind of silence that exists only at the center of a storm. In the high-stakes theater of the global war on terror, this silence is often the precursor to a 17-second room clearance, the rhythmic thud of suppressed carbines, and the surgical extraction of a high-value target. Most people associate this precise violence with the 22nd Special Air Service, the SAS. They are the hammer of the British Crown, the men who emerge from the smoke of a frame charge to redefine reality for the enemies of the state. But behind every door the SAS kicks down, behind every jackpot confirmed by a biometric scanner, there is a ghost that has been living in the shadows for months. A ghost that even the SAS speaks of with a hushed, professional reverence. This is the Special Reconnaissance Regiment, the SRR. If the SAS is the scalpel, the SRR is the optic. They are the unit that provides the ocular intimacy required for the scalpel to strike. They are the thinking sensors who exist in the negative space of a city, blending so perfectly into the social geography that they become part of the background noise. To understand the SRR, you have to look past the tactical gear and the night vision goggles. You have to look into a world where a grocery bag is a more lethal weapon than a rifle, and where the ability to sit motionless in a rusted Toyota for 48 hours is the ultimate military standard. The year was 2006. Baghdad was a laboratory of sectarian madness. The American machine, the multi-billion-dollar intelligence apparatus of the NSA and the CIA, was drowning in its own data. They had drones at 20,000 feet. They had signals intercept arrays that could vacuum up every cellular ping in the green zone. But they were blind to the human residue. They could see a vehicle move from point A to point B, but they couldn't sense the vibe of the driver. They couldn't tell if the man entering a mosque was a holy man or the architect of the next suicide blast. A combined SAS and Delta Force task force was prepping for a raid in Sadr City. They had digital probability. The satellites showed a high concentration of movement in a specific 3-story concrete block. The algorithms flagged it as a node of interest. But the SAS commander, a man forged in the austerity of Hereford, refused to launch. He knew that in a city of 2 million people, probability is a suicide note. He needed binary certainty. He called for the ghosts. 3 weeks earlier, a couple had moved into a derelict apartment overlooking that same concrete block. To the local Mahdi army lookouts, they were just another pair of displaced refugees. A man with a graying beard and a woman in a traditional abaya arguing over the price of bread. They didn't carry radios. They didn't use satellite phones. They bought their food from the local market and used the same stagnant water as everyone else. But inside their apartment, hidden behind a false wall of rotting plaster, was the most sophisticated surveillance suite in the British arsenal. These were operators of the SRR. While the American drones were looking for steel, the SRR was looking for intent. They watched the way the target's guards held their hands, the reflexive muscle memory of men who were used to carrying AK-47s under their robes. They recorded the timing of the guard shifts, the acoustic signature of the front door's latch, and the specific rhythm of the courier's bicycle. They were encoding the enemy's soul. On the night of the raid, as the SAS assault team approached the perimeter in suppressed Q cars, a single text message was sent to a burner phone. No encryption codes, no military jargon, just a signal of the shadow. The SAS breached the door in 12 seconds. They found the target in the basement, exactly where the couple had predicted, his escape tunnel already blocked by a residue of information provided by the watchers. When the target was secured, a young SAS trooper, a veteran of 3 tours, looked up at the apartment across the street. He saw a flicker of a curtain.
He knew that for 21 days, those two people had lived in a world of urine-filled bottles and cold rations, sitting in the dark, watching his back before he even knew he was going to be there. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Baghdad night. "They're a different species," the trooper later remarked in a classified debrief. "We do the 17 seconds. They do the 17 Ds. I'd rather face a battalion of insurgents than have one of them decide I'm an anomaly." Wait, before we dive into the harrowing selection of the void that produces these ghosts, I have a question for you. If you had to choose between being the Hammer, SAS, or the I, SRR, which one fits your psychology? Drop a comment below with Hammer or I. If you value this deep dive into the most secretive layers of military science, hit the like button and subscribe. We are building the thinking soldier community, and your engagement is the only thing that keeps us off the algorithm's redacted list. To understand how the SRR became the unit the SAS fears, you have to understand the architecture of the selection. In the American Tier 1 community, Delta or the SEALs, selection is a test of the athlete. They want the man who can survive Hell Week, the man who can swim 10 miles and run 40. The SAS Hills phase in the Brecon Beacons is similar, a test of the residue of the will. But the SRR selection is a test of the ghost. It is known internally as the Special Reconnaissance Selection Course. While they draw candidates from the SAS and the SBS, the vast majority fail within the first 48 hours.
Not because they aren't fit, but because they are too visible. The SRR is not looking for the alpha male. They are looking for the adaptive anomaly. They want the person who can walk into a crowded pub in Belfast or a tea house in Kabul and remain socially transparent. In the Hereford world, they call this the austerity of the ego. A candidate must be willing to surrender their identity, their rank, and their hero narrative to become a grey man. The selection process involves a phase called the urban abyss. A candidate is dropped in a major British city with nothing but a fake civilian legend and a mission to track a professional counter-surveillance team. The machine is following them, former operators who know every trick in the book. If the candidate is spotted even once, they are binned. In the SAS, if you're compromised, you fight, an instructor once said. In the SRR, if you're compromised, you've already lost the war. We don't train soldiers to win firefights, we train ghosts to prevent them. The psychological pressure is binary. You are either invisible or you are a failure. There is no middle ground. Candidates are forced to live in scrapes, concealed spaces in urban environments, for weeks. They are deprived of sleep, feedback, and human contact. They are being searched for by police, by intelligence services, and by the grey men of the cadre. They must maintain their reflexive calm, while their brain is screaming that the world is closing in. This produces a species of soldier that operates on a different harmonic frequency. They don't look like the commandos of the evening news. They are medium height, unremarkable in appearance, and possess a biometric stillness that allows them to sense the vibe of a street better than a multi-million-dollar sensor. The SRR was officially stood up in 2005, but its DNA is much older. It is the direct descendant of the 14th Intelligence Company, the legendary Det that fought the secret war in Northern Ireland. For 30 years, while the big army was getting bogged down in sectarian politics, the Det was living in the walls of the IRA's heartlands. They were the ones who taught the British military that information is the only armor. When the global war on terror began, the Pentagon realized it had a category error. It had built a military that was too powerful to be precise. They had the hammer, but they were blind. They looked at the British ghosts and realized that the Hereford standard of individual autonomy was the only thing that could survive the urban abyss. But the relationship between the ghosts and the machine is one of permanent friction. The American Directorate hates a secret it doesn't control. The SRR, however, exists in a state of institutional anonymity. Even within the Ministry of Defense, their budget is a black hole. Their operations are redacted from the history books before they even conclude. This part 1 of The Unit, even the SAS calls Ghosts, is the story of the victory of the eye. It is the story of why the most dangerous man in the room is the one you didn't notice. It is the foundation of a legacy built on austerity, silence, and the 17th day. The SAS is already at the door. The machine is already counting down. But the ghost has been there for 3 weeks. And the 17th second of the enemy's life is just a resolved variable for the SRR. What happens when the ghost is caught in the abyss? What happens when the eye has to become the knife? To the conventional military mind, power is measured in the resonance of a jet engine, the weight of a ballistic plate, and the thermal resolution of a satellite feed. It is a loud metric. But in the Special Reconnaissance Regiment, power is an acoustic zero. It is the ability to occupy the space between 2 atoms of conversation in a crowded marketplace and remain entirely undetected. If the 22nd SAS is the residue of the will, then the SRR is the residue of the environment. They do not fight the terrain, they inhabit it. To understand the SRR's unique lethality, you have to understand the chemical shift that occurred in British military intelligence during the 1970s. While the Pentagon was perfecting the machine of the Cold War, building sensors that could track a tank from the stratosphere, the British were losing a low-frequency war in the streets of Belfast. The big army was blind. They would send patrols of 80 men in armoured Saracens into the Falls Road, and the neighbourhood would react like a biological organism. The vibe would change instantly. Children would whistle, women would bang dustbin lids, and the IRA, thinking insurgent, would simply vaporize through a back alley. The British realized they had a category error in their doctrine. You cannot catch a ghost with a hammer. You need another ghost. This led to the birth of the 14th Intelligence Company, known as the Det. They were the biological ancestors of the SRR. They were men and women who were told to park their uniforms and their ranks at the gate and disappear into the sectarian abyss. They didn't move in convoys. They moved in Q cars, beat-up Ford Escorts and Vauxhalls with modified engines and hidden compartments for suppressed pistols. They didn't live in barracks. They lived in static ops, crawl spaces behind the walls of derelict flats, where they would sit for 14 days, watching a single doorway through a pinhole lens. This is the law of the pinhole. It is the foundation of the SRR's Ocular Intimacy. In the American system, reconnaissance is often sensor-centric. If you want to know what's inside a house, you fly a drone with synthetic aperture radar, but radar cannot tell you the residue of fear in a guard's eyes. It cannot tell you if the vibe of a meeting is aggressive or celebratory. The SRR uses the most advanced sensor ever designed, the human brain, selected for its adaptive autonomy. One of the most guarded secrets of the SRR, and the one that distinguishes it most sharply from the SAS, is the female factor. In the hyper-masculine world of Tier 1 Special Forces, the SRR realized a cold truth. A man sitting alone in a car in a hostile neighborhood is an anomaly. A man walking down a street with a tactical rucksack is a target. But a couple arguing in a rusted Opel, or a woman pushing a pram past a militia safe house is background noise. Women have been part of the SRR's operational core since its inception as the Det. They are not support staff, They are operators of the void. They undergo the same psychological dismantling as the men. They learn the 17-second room entry. They master the high-velocity J-turn, and they develop a cognitive stamina that allows them to live a lie for months at a time. In the Middle East, this became the ultimate force multiplier. While American SEAL teams were struggling to interact with local populations due to cultural barriers, the SRR was sending husband and wife teams into the heart of insurgent territory. Wait, think about that for a second. In a world where we are told that mass wins wars, how much is one invisible woman worth compared to a battalion of tanks? Drop a comment below. Does the female factor make the SRR the smartest unit in the world? Let's hear your thoughts. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into the grey space of military history, hit the like button and subscribe. We are uncovering the stories the machine wants to keep redacted. To appreciate the austerity of the craft, we must examine a specific, harrowing technique known as the Belfast Walk Past. Imagine a street in Basra, 2005. It is a denied zone. Any Westerner spotted here is either a hostage or a corpse. The American Directorate has a high-probability target in a building mid-block, but the satellite imagery is obscured by the thermal wash of the surrounding desert. They don't know which window has the sniper, or which door is rigged with a pressure plate IED. An SRR operator enters the street. He is not wearing a helmet. He is not carrying a visible rifle. He is dressed as a local laborer, his skin darkened by the sun, his gait adjusted to match the rhythm of the city. In his hand is a tattered grocery bag containing a loaf of bread and a hidden wide-angle ocular sensor. He performs the walk past. It lasts exactly 90 seconds. To a bystander, he is a nobody, but the operator's brain is functioning like a biological supercomputer. He is encoding the environment. He notes the residue of dirt on the door handle, indicating how often it is used. He hears the acoustic leakage of a radio from the second floor. He senses the vibe of the lookout on the corner, the way the man's eyes scan but never linger. By the time he reaches the end of the street, the SRR has a surgical map of the target. They know the binary vulnerability of the building. This is information that a billion-dollar drone cannot provide because a drone is a machine and the street is a human conversation. But invisibility has a price of iron. In September 2005, the world received a rare glimpse into the abyss of the SRR during what became known as the Jamiat incident in Basra. Two operators, Thorne and Miller, were conducting a mobile surveillance mission. They were in a civilian car, dressed in local clothes, monitoring a high-threat node within the local police force. They were thinking soldiers caught in a systemic trap. The local police, who had been badged and trained by the American machine, had been fully infiltrated by the Mahdi army. They weren't police. They were a death squad with state-issued IDs. They spotted Thorne and Miller, not because the operators made a mistake, but because the machine had become too predictable. The cars the British used, though civilian, had been pattern-mapped by the militia. The ghosts were compromised. A high-speed chase erupted through the narrow alleys of Basra. Thorne and Miller fired their suppressed 9mm pistols from the windows of their car, not to kill, but to create a vacuum of pursuit. They were eventually cornered and detained by the very police the coalition was supposed to be mentoring. They were taken to the Jamiat police station, a concrete tomb where the rules of the Geneva Convention did not exist. The British command faced a binary crisis. If they negotiated, the operators would be handed over to the militia and executed on camera. If they attacked, they would be assaulting an Allied police station. The machine in London hesitated, but the Hereford Standard does not wait for a committee.
the SAS launched a mechanical resurrection. They didn't send negotiators, they sent warrior armored vehicles. They drove through the walls of the police station. They dismantled the building with 40 tons of steel. They found the residue of Thorne and Miller, their civilian clothes torn, their legends shattered, but their will intact. They were extracted in the 17th second of the breach. The incident was a diplomatic disaster, but it was a tactical revelation. It proved that the shield of the local police was a lie.
It proved that the ghosts were the only ones who knew the truth of the cellar. The Jamiat incident changed the vibe of the Iraq War for the British. They realized that they were not just fighting an insurgency, they were fighting a corrupted environment. And in a corrupted environment, the ghost must become the knife. The SRR's tradecraft evolved. They moved into the digital abyss. They began to use social intelligence, mapping the families of the enemy. They realized that an insurgent commander doesn't hide from a satellite, he hides from disgrace. They started to target the logistical residue of the militias, the men who provided the fuel, the food, and the safe passage. They became the guardians of the kill chain. In the American JSOC headquarters at Balad, the machine was starting to pay attention. General Stanley McChrystal, the man who was turning the Iraq War into an industrialized special ops engine, began to request SRR operators for his fusion cells. He realized that his Delta teams were the best hammers in the world, but they were hitting empty rooms because their intelligence was digital and the enemy was social. "The Brits have something we don't," a senior CIA officer reportedly noted. "They have patience of the bone. They are willing to sit in the dirt and wait for the human signal while we are busy looking for the electronic ping. We have the satellites, but they have the vibe." This is part 2 of The Unit. Even the SAS calls ghosts, is the story of the alchemy of the environment. It is the story of how the British species learned to use the very structure of society as their armor. It is the story of why a woman in a hijab can be more dangerous than a Reaper drone. The machine is still processing the data from Jamiat. The politicians are still drafting the apologies. But in the vacuum of Hereford, the SRR is already prepping for the next walk past. They are cleaning their suppressed 9mm. They are encoding the next target. The SAS is at the perimeter. The thunder is coming. But the ghost is already in the kitchen, listening to the enemy breathe. What happens to the mind of an operator who lives as a ghost for 10 years? What is the price of the lie? The most dangerous weapon in the arsenal of the Special Reconnaissance Regiment is not the suppressed carbine, the thermal optic, or the high-performance Q car. It is a psychological construct known in the Hereford world as the legend. To a civilian, a legend is a story. To a conventional soldier, it is a cover story. But to an SRR operator, a legend is a secondary biological existence. It is a fabricated soul, meticulously engineered to inhabit the negative space of a hostile society. It has a name, a family history, a specific dialect, and a set of mundane habits that mask the predatory residue of a Tier 1 killer. But inhabiting a legend for months or years creates a metabolic debt that no amount of physical training can prepare a human being for. In the American Special Operations community, the OODA loop is a tactical cycle used to outpace the enemy. In the SRR, the OODA loop is an internal siege. You are constantly observing your own behavior through the eyes of the enemy, deciding which part of your primary self to suppress, and acting out a character that must never, for a single millisecond, betray an anomaly. This is the price of the lie. It is the biological erosion of the individual. To understand the psychological deconstruction required to produce an SRR operator, we must look at the post-selection integration. After a candidate survives the urban abyss of selection, they are moved into a vacuum of order. They are taught the science of social camouflage. They study the acoustic signature of different social classes. They learn how to walk like a man with a bad back, how to smoke like a local shopkeeper, and how to abstain from the gaze. In the military, you are taught to make eye contact to establish dominance. In the SRR, you are taught to look through people, to become a visual zero. This training produces a phenomenon known as dissociative mastery. The operator becomes a machine of reflexes, hidden beneath a skin of normalcy. The SRR's methodology was put to the ultimate test during the metastasis of the global jihad in the mid-2000s. While the American machine was focusing on the big targets, the Zarqawis and the Bin Ladens, the SRR was focusing on the logistical shadow. They realized that a spectacular suicide attack is not a random event. It is a resolved equation of logistics. It requires a safe house, a bomb maker, a courier, and a financier. The SRR operators moved into the denied zones of the Middle East to map these human networks. They didn't use satellites to find the safe houses. They used ocular intimacy. Wait, before we break down a specific ghost mission in the heart of the Syrian borderlands, I have a question for the real thinkers in this community. If you had to disappear for 3 years, leaving your name and your life behind to live in a cellar watching an enemy, would you break? Or would the residue of your will hold? Drop a comment below. I would hold, or I would break. Let's see who really has the Hereford vibe. And if you're finding this deep dive into the psychology of the ghost fascinating, hit the like button and subscribe. We are building the most elite community on YouTube, and we don't want you to miss the 17th second of Part 4. The operation was designated Vessel of Truth. The year was 2007. The American Directorate had a high probability target, an Iraqi chemical engineer who had defected to a jihadist cell and was reportedly developing a stabilized version of chlorine gas for urban IEDs. The Americans had used their full-spectrum dominance to track his satellite phone to a specific neighborhood in Al-Qaim, near the Syrian border. They wanted to launch a loud lethality strike, a helicopter-borne raid with 60 Rangers to level the sector. The British liaison at JSOC, a veteran of the Det, objected. "Your satellite phone ping is a digital mirage," he reportedly said. "He's been using couriers for 3 days. The phone is in a trash can. If you hit that neighborhood, you'll kill 40 civilians and the architect will be 5 miles away before the first Black Hawk touches the deck. We need a social sensor." 2 SRR operators, a man and a woman, were inserted into the neighborhood. They didn't arrive by parachute. They arrived in a tattered blue minibus, carrying a legend as itinerant carpet sellers. They moved into a room in a boarding house less than 50 meters from the high-threat node. For 14 days, they practiced the long wait. This is the austerity of the ghost. They didn't have a secure radio link. They didn't have body armor. They had 2 suppressed Sig Sauer pistols hidden in the lining of a prayer rug. They lived on bread and dirty water. They spent their days sitting in the shade of a wall, watching the pattern of life. In the American system, reconnaissance is a search for steel. You look for weapons, for radios, for armor. In the SRR, reconnaissance is a search for residue. They watched the vibe of the house. They noted the way the local children avoided the front door, a biological alarm. They heard the acoustic anomaly of a high-capacity air conditioner running in a house that supposedly had no power, the signature of a laboratory. They saw a woman enter the house with a basket of vegetables every evening at 18:45, but she never came out with the same basket. She's the logistical courier,
the female operator whispered into a microscopic burp transmitter.
She's carrying the chemicals in and the waste out. The architect is in the basement. He's been there for 96 hours. The window is opening. The American machine was still calculating the collateral risk of a missile strike, but the thinking soldiers of the SRR had already provided the binary certainty. The SAS Snatch Squad moved in that night. They didn't use helicopters. They used Q cars provided by the SRR. They entered the house through a dead zone identified by the watchers, a side window where the security guard habitually fell asleep at 3 o'clock. The raid lasted exactly 14 seconds. The architect was neutralized. The laboratory was secured. The G Squadron SAS operators moved with a reflexive fluidity that was only possible because the ghosts had already mapped every step of the floor. As the SAS extracted the target, the two carpet sellers stayed in their room. They didn't join the fight. They didn't reveal their identity. They stayed in the vacuum. They had to wait for another 4 days, maintaining their legend, while the neighborhood was swarming with militia looking for the spies before they could safely vaporize across the border. When they returned to Hereford, they were metabolically shattered. They had spent 18 days in a state of hypervigilance, breathing the same air as the men who would have tortured them to death. This creates a neural scarring that the big army ignores. The SRR realized that the greatest threat to their operators was not the enemy's bullet, but the erosion of the primary self. When you spend 200 days a year being someone else, the original person begins to fade. You forget the sound of your own voice. You look in the mirror and you see the gray man looking back. This is the austerity of the soul. By the late 2000s, the SRR had become the digital nervous system for the entire Western Tier 1 community. They were the ones who taught Delta Force how to abstain from the technology to find the human truth. They developed the F3EA, find, fix, finish, exploit, analyze cycle into a social intelligence weapon. They began to target the vibe of the city. They realized that an insurgency is not an army, it is a social movement. And to defeat a movement, you have to infect it. They began to run false flag operations, creating anomalies within the militia structures that caused the insurgents to turn on themselves. They were engineering chaos from the inside. But the machine in Washington and London was starting to grow nervous. The SRR was becoming too autonomous. They operated in a state of institutional plausible deniability. Their missions were so secret that often the local British or American military commanders didn't even know they were in the theater. The SRR are like ghosts in the attic, a retired British general reportedly said. You know they're there because you hear the floorboards creak, or the next morning the enemy is dead. But if you go upstairs to look for them, the room is empty. It's an uncomfortable way to run a war, but it's the only way to win this one. This is part 3 of The Unit, even the SAS calls ghosts, is the story of the residue of the identity. It is the story of how the British species sacrificed their humanity to become the eyes of the state. It is the story of the 17th day, the moment when the watcher realized they have been in the dark so long they can no longer see the light. The SAS is currently prepping for a mission in a new, denied area. The drones are checking their batteries. The satellites are adjusting their orbits. But the ghost has been there for 6 months. They are sitting in a market, drinking tea, and watching you watch them. What happens when the ghost decides to go rogue? What happens when the I becomes the enemy? The most lethal vulnerability in the architecture of the Special Reconnaissance Regiment is not a breach in digital encryption or the physical compromise of a safe house. It is a biological phenomenon known internally as identity metastasis. In the Hereford world, the thinking soldier is trained to treat their own mind as a reconfigurable hard drive. They partition their memories, their emotions, and their primary personality to make room for the legend. But when an operator remains in the abyss for too long, when they spend more time breathing the air of the enemy than the air of their own home, the partitions begin to dissolve. The legend starts to inhabit the man, and the man becomes a ghost in his own nervous system. This is the biological burnout of the Tier 1 world. It is the moment the ghost begins to believe the lie. The year was 2012. The theatre was the Sahel, a 3 million square mile vacuum of order stretching across the burning heart of Africa. The American machine was attempting to manage the region through technological saturation. They had established a massive drone hub in Niamey, Niger. They were pouring billions into satellite-guided targeting cycles to track Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM. The Pentagon viewed the Sahel as a mathematical grid. If they could see the heat signatures of the Toyota Hiluxes moving across the dunes, they believed they owned the war. But the thinking soldiers of the SRR knew the desert was a lie. They knew that a drone at 20,000 feet cannot distinguish between a nomadic Tuareg shepherd and a high-ranking jihadist financier. They are both just pixels of heat. To find the truth, you have to abstain from the sky. You have to walk into the dust. The SRR launched Operation Sentinel's Grief. An operator, identified in the residue of classified records as Thorn, a name inherited from the mentor we encountered in previous chapters, was inserted into a remote nomadic community near the Mali-Niger border. His mission was the ultimate austerity of the long wait. He was to live as a Tuareg grey man for 9 months. No radio, no GPS, no Link 16 connection to the American Directorate. He carried a small, solar-powered burstcom device hidden inside a hollowed-out camel saddle and a suppressed Glock 19 buried in a sack of grain. For 270 days, Thorn inhabited the vacuum. To understand the psychological filtration this required, you have to look at the chemistry of dissociation. In the American system, an undercover mission is usually a short-duration event supported by a backstop team. In the SRR, you are functionally alone. Thorn learned to speak the Tamashek dialect with the specific acoustic slur of the northern tribes. He learned to sense the vibe of the desert, to know when a sandstorm was approaching by the change in the static electricity of his skin. He ate goat eyes and drank brackish water. He encoded his body to survive on 1,200 calories a day. He was mapping the social abyss. He identified the human nodes of the AQIM smuggling routes. He sat in tents with men who had $5 million bounties on their heads, listening to them talk about the residue of their hate. He was the invisible sentinel at the center of the jihadist logistics chain. Wait, before we reveal the moment Thorn's legend began to eat his soul, I have a question for the 1% who have stayed with us through this entire series. If you were a commander and your best operator stopped sending signals from the desert, would you send a rescue team to save him? Or a liquidator to protect the secret? Drop a comment below. Rescue or protect? Let's see how you handle the binary choice. And if you value this deep dive into the neurobiology of the ghost, hit the like button and subscribe. We are building the thinking soldier community, and your engagement is the only thing that keeps us from being redacted by the algorithm. By the 7th month of Operation Sentinel's Grief, the Anomaly appeared. Back in the windowless target cell at Sterling Lines, the SRR analysts noticed a change in Thorn's burst comm patterns. His reports were no longer clinical. They were starting to reflect the vibe of the Tuareg. He was using local metaphors, He was showing empathetic leakage toward the very men he was sent to destroy. This is the metastasis of the shadow. Thorn had lived the lie so perfectly that his primary self, the SAS-trained operator from Hereford, was beginning to brown out. In the American doctrine, this would be flagged as going native. The CIA would call it a security risk, but the SRR viewed it as a biological red line. The machine in London realized that Thorn's OODA loop was now being cycled through the psychology of the enemy. The director of Special Forces made a binary decision. He wouldn't send a battalion. He wouldn't send a drone strike. He called for a 4-man recce team from G Squadron SAS, the Hammers, to conduct an evaluation. Officially, it was a resupply mission. In reality, it was a sanity check. The SAS team inserted via high-altitude low opening, halo jump, into the Malian desert. They moved for 3 days on foot, navigating by the stars, practicing the austerity of the ghost Thorn had taught them. They reached the nomadic camp at 3 o'clock. They watched the tents through their thermal optics. They saw Thorn. He was sitting by a dying fire, dressed in indigo-dyed robes. He was alone. But the way he was sitting was an anomaly. He wasn't scanning the perimeter with the Hereford eye. He was staring at the stars with a stagnant gaze. The SAS team leader, a man who had served with Thorn in Baghdad, moved into the vacuum of the camp. He didn't draw his weapon. He practiced the austerity of the voice. "Thorn," he whispered, "the clock tower is ticking. It's time for the 17th second." Thorn didn't flinch. He didn't reach for his buried Glock. He looked at the SAS operator as if he were looking at a category error from another planet. "The clock tower is a lie," Thorn said in a voice that was no longer British. "The machine in London is a lie. There is only the wind and the residue of the sand." The ghost had broken the standard. In that moment, the SAS team faced the ultimate Hereford binary. Thorn was a brother of the species. He knew every secret of the SRR. He knew the names of the ghosts in Kabul and Belfast. He was the digital nervous system of the Sahel. If he stayed in the desert, he was the most dangerous high-threat node in the world. The SAS team leader looked at his men. They were the residue. They were the ones who had survived the long drag. They knew that in their world, mercy is a tactical error. But they also knew the price of iron. They realized that Thorn hadn't betrayed the regiment. He had been dismantled by it. The SRR had asked for his soul, and the soul had simply evaporated into the environment. "We're taking you home, Thorn," the team leader said, his hand resting on his carbine. "By sea or by land, you choose the species you want to be today." The confrontation lasted exactly 17 minutes, a geological epoch in the world of Special Forces. Thorn eventually stood up. The muscle memory of Hereford, the reflexive motor patterns of the soldier, finally overrode the Tuareg legend. He walked toward the SAS team, leaving the indigo robes in the dust. He was extracted by a low-profile flight 48 hours later. Thorn never returned to operational duty. He was moved to a black site in the UK for decompression, a process that the SRR uses to reclaim the identities of their broken ghosts. He became a residue of the secret, a man who lives in a quiet village under a third legend, watching the world through a window, waiting for a signal that will never come. The final verdict on Operation Sentinel's Grief was redacted from the Ministry of Defense files, but the law remained. It became the warning of the Sahel. It proved that the SRR is the only unit that can find the truth,
But it also proved that the truth can destroy the man. The American Directorate heard rumors of the broken ghost. They laughed. They pointed to their drones and their sanitized war. They believed their machine was immune to the metastasis of the shadow. They were wrong. 4 years later, in the urban abyss of an Eastern European city, the American machine would face its own identity crisis. And they would realize, too late, that the only thing more dangerous than an enemy you can't see is a ghost who has forgotten who he's fighting for. This is part 4 of The Unit. Even the SAS calls ghosts, is the story of the austerity of the mind. It is the story of how the British species pushes the human nervous system to the 17th day, the point of no return. The SAS is at the door. The machine is checking the signals. Na prizrak użynie w komnaty. On, sama komnata. I on ждет, когда вы совершите ошибку. What happens when the ghost returns to the normal world? Can a thinking soldier ever truly finish selection? In the quiet, rain-slicked suburbs of a market town in Herefordshire, a man sits in a garden.
He is in his late 40s, dressed in an unremarkable waterproof jacket and worn-out jeans. He is drinking a cup of tea, watching the wind move through the branches of an oak tree. To his neighbors, he is a retired logistics manager, a quiet individual who did something in the military but never talks about it. They see a man who is perhaps a bit too observant, a man who never sits with his back to the door in the local pub, but they attribute it to the residue of a standard army career. They are wrong. This man is a category error of the modern world. He is the residue of 10,000 hours spent in the urban abyss. He has lived as a taxi driver in Baghdad, a carpet seller in Al-Qaim, and a nomadic shepherd in the Sahel. He has thought his way through 3 different continents and 4 different identities. He has watched men die through a pinhole lens and has felt the acoustic silence of a suicide bomber's final breath. He is an operator of the Special Reconnaissance Regiment, and for him the normal world is the most difficult, denied zone he has ever encountered. This is the final stage of the SRR life cycle, the declassification of the soul. In the Hereford world, they don't have a retirement ceremony. There are no medals presented in front of a cheering crowd. There is only a silent exit. An operator walks through the gate of Sterling lines for the last time. Their security clearance is archived, and they are handed back a name that they haven't truly inhabited in a decade. But the machine of the regiment has already achieved its goal. It has created a biological sentinel, a human being who can never truly stop scanning. To understand the final legacy of the SRR, we must look at the metamorphosis of the Tier 1 doctrine in the 2020s. The lessons learned by the ghosts in the basements of Iraq and the dunes of Mali have now become the operating system for the entire Western Special Operations community. The Pentagon has finally accepted the British heresy that in a world of high-definition surveillance and AI-driven targeting, the only true armor is anonymity. Wait, before we reveal the SRR's current shadow war against the digital panopticon, I have a final question for the 1% who have completed this 5-part journey. If a soldier saves the world but can never tell a soul, and their name is eventually redacted from history, was it worth it? Drop a comment below with redacted or witnessed. Let's see where the thinking soldier community stands on the price of the secret. If you found this series to be the highest standard of military history on YouTube, hit the like button and subscribe. You are now part of the residue. The SRR is currently engaged in its most dangerous mission to date, the war against the digital abyss. In the 1970s, the Det only had to worry about the vibe of a Belfast street. They had to watch for the lookouts and the whistlers. In the 2000s, they had to worry about signals intelligence and the thermal wash. But today, the ghost faces an enemy that never sleeps and never blinks: the global surveillance machine. We live in a world of pervasive facial recognition, gait analysis, and biometric fingerprinting. Every smartphone is a sensor. Every street lamp is a node. For a conventional Special Forces unit, this is a tactical barrier. For the SRR, it is an existential threat. If an operator's face is captured once by a high-resolution CCTV camera in a city like Moscow, Tehran, or Beijing, their legend is compromised forever. Their ocular intimacy is deleted by an algorithm. The thinking soldiers of Hereford have responded with a new form of austerity: biological masking. They are training to defeat the machine using the residue of the human. They study how to manipulate their biometric signature to change the way they walk, the way they blink, and the heat signature of their own breath. They are learning to navigate the digital vacuum, moving through the blind spots of the satellite grids and the black holes of the fiber optic networks. They have become the antidote to the algorithm. In the American JSOC headquarters, the analysts look at the SRR and see a friction point. They want the ghosts to be integrated into the machine. They want the SRR operators to carry smart gear that feeds data into the global brain. But the SRR refuses. They know that a signal is a death note. They maintain their austerity of force, relying on the mechanical stethoscope and the paper map, while the rest of the world is drowning in silicon. But what is the final verdict on the mind of the operator? We must return to Thorn, the broken ghost we encountered in Part 4. His story is the shadow that follows every success of the regiment. The decompression process in the SRR is a clinical, windowless ritual. Operators are moved to safe houses in the UK, where they spend weeks being dismantled and rebuilt one last time. They are asked to surrender the legends they have lived. They are forced to confront the residue of the violence they have witnessed. You spend 10 years learning how to not be yourself, one retired operator noted in a private journal. And then the regiment gives you 30 days to figure out who the original was. But the original is gone. He died on the long drag in the beacons or in the urban abyss of Belfast. What's left is just a collection of reflexes in a civilian suit. You look at your wife and you see a security risk. You look at your children and you look for their pattern of life. The standard one. You are the residue of a ghost. The suicide rates and the mechanical exhaustion of the SRR veteran community are the highest in the British military. It is the price of iron for being the eyes of the state. They have thought so much for so long that their brains have heat warped. Yet the clock tower in Hereford continues to tick. As we conclude this part 5 of the unit even the SAS calls ghosts, the 17th second is approaching for a new generation. Right now, a candidate is sitting in a rusted van in a British city, watching a door. They are cold, they are hungry, and they are functionally alone. They want to quit. They want the machine to come and save them, but then they think of the ghosts who went before them. They think of the Det in the walls of Belfast. They think of the husband and wife teams in Sadr City. They think of Thorn in the Sahel. They realize that they are not soldiers anymore. They are a species. They are the thinking sensors who allow the hammer to strike. They are the silence that allows the thunder to be heard. The SRR remains the most secretive, most misunderstood, and most lethal unit in the Western world. Not because of their guns, but because of their patience. They have proven that information is the only armor, and that a ghost who understands the vibe is worth more than a battalion of organization men. The SAS is already at the door. The machine is already counting down. But the ghost has already been there for a decade, and they are watching you right now. Selection never ends. The 17 seconds are always now, and the species is still watching from the shadows. Don't ignore the warning. Don't bet against the ghost, because by the time you see the anomaly, the SRR has already resolved the variable. Who dares wins. The shadows are watching.